complete voiceover script. How can you always be on the front pages? For years, Sarah Ferguson kept her silence about Andrew. She stood by him through scandal after scandal, shielding her daughters from the worst of it. But something has changed. Behind closed doors, a story has been building, one involving broken trust, hidden truths, and what Andrew allegedly did to the very girls he was supposed to protect. Now Fergie is speaking out, and what she has revealed has sent shockwaves through the royal family. With tensions rising and the full picture finally coming to light, many are asking how it ever came to this. So what really happened? Join us as we break down the full story. To understand Andrew's relationship with his daughters, it helps to first look at his marriage to their mother, because the patterns that later shaped his role as a father were already visible before either child was born. On July 23, 1986, Andrew married Sarah Ferguson in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey, watched by millions around the world. She was in her mid-20s, lively and natural, in a way that felt different from the usual image of the royal family. He was the Queen's second son, confident in his naval uniform and newly given the title Duke of York. At the time, the public saw them as a happy and promising couple, but the reality of their marriage quickly became something far more complicated. Andrew's career in the Royal Navy meant he was often away for long periods. Months would pass with little contact. He was not physically present for much of their life together. Meanwhile, Sarah had stepped into a highly controlled and demanding environment, leaving behind her independence and career. She was expected to adjust to royal life, manage intense public attention, and follow strict rules, all without consistent support from her husband. In later interviews, Sarah explained that during the early years of their marriage, they spent very little time together. Across 5 years, they were only physically in the same place for a small portion of each year. This meant she faced major life moments, largely on her own, including pregnancy and early motherhood. She was raising young children, while also learning how to function within one of the most scrutinized institutions in the world. The emotional toll of this situation became visible to those around her. Visitors to the palace during that time described Sarah Ferguson as a woman who seemed isolated and overwhelmed. Despite living in grand surroundings, she lacked the kind of personal support that might have made the transition easier. To put a number on it, over a 5-year period, Andrew and Sarah were in the same place for roughly 40 days each year. This was during some of the most important moments of her life, while she was pregnant with Princess Beatrice and later while caring for a newborn and then a toddler. At the same time, she was trying to find her place within the British royal family, a system with strict expectations, constant public attention, and very little guidance on how to cope with it all. People who saw her during that period noticed the strain. Journalist Jenny Murray later spoke about visiting her at Buckingham Palace in 1989 and being struck by how difficult things seemed. She recalled initially mistaking Sarah for a member of staff when she appeared in casual clothes, which highlighted how far removed the reality was from the public image. What stood out most was how alone she appeared. She was raising a young child largely by herself and was not included in her husband's travels, leaving her uncertain about his life when he was away. This period set the tone for what followed. The marriage was defined less by open conflict and more by distance and absence. Sarah carried most of the responsibility at home, while Andrew's role remained largely separate. Years later, he would say in a television interview that he clearly remembered being at home with his daughters on a particular occasion. However, that claim sits against a much longer pattern in which he was often not there during their early childhood. Sarah and Andrew separated in 1992. Princess Beatrice was 4 years old and Princess Eugenie was 2. By then, the distance that had shaped their marriage had become impossible to ignore. Even when Andrew was still living in the same household, it often felt as though he wasn't really there. And that absence had consequences for his children in ways that are rarely discussed publicly. 40 days a year may sound like a simple statistic, but it does not capture what it feels like to grow up in a home where a father is more of a visitor than a constant presence. That experience is better understood through the lives of his daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie. Beatrice was born in 1988 and Eugenie followed in 1990. By the time Eugenie was old enough to form early memories, their parents had already separated. This meant that for most of their childhood, their father's presence was inconsistent. He appeared for official duties, public events, and moments that were recorded, but was largely absent from the ordinary parts of daily life that shaped a child's sense of stability. The everyday structure of parenting, the routines that often go unnoticed, was not something they regularly experienced with him. There were no consistent school runs, no steady involvement in homework, no routine attendance at school events or quiet evenings at home. Those small repeated moments are what build familiarity and trust, and in this case they were largely missing from his role as a father. Instead, That responsibility fell almost entirely on their mother, Sarah Ferguson. She managed their upbringing largely on her own, within the unusual environment of royal residences, while also facing intense public criticism. The pressure of constant media attention did not lessen her responsibilities. If anything, it made them more difficult. Despite that, she remained a consistent figure in her daughters' lives. Clues about how this dynamic affected them can be seen in how they speak about their upbringing as adults. Eugenie, for example, has spoken about her experience with scoliosis as a child, describing how her mother noticed the issue early and supported her through treatment and recovery. She has emphasized the confidence her mother helped her build, especially in learning to accept and take pride in her body after surgery. In telling that story, the focus remains firmly on her mother's role, not a word about her father. A medical diagnosis at 12, a surgery, a recovery, a lifetime of learning to carry herself with confidence, and in Eugenie's own telling of that story, Andrew is not in it. The person who noticed, who acted, who shaped how she felt about herself on the other side of it, that was Ferguson. That was always Ferguson. Beatrice told a similar story from a different angle. When she appeared on This Morning in May 2024 to discuss her mother's cancer recovery, she described Ferguson as someone whose resilience keeps her going. She called her a phenomenal icon. She spoke about everything her mother had been through and how she was now at 64, coming into her own. It was the kind of tribute you give to someone who was there for the things that mattered, who showed up without being asked, who did the work when no one was watching. Andrew's name did not come up. He had the title. He had the portraits and the uniform and the formal occasions where he stood in the right place at the right time. But the person who raised Beatrice and Eugenie, who caught the diagnosis, who sat through the recovery, who built the confidence and held the household steady through decades of public chaos, was the woman he had left to manage it alone. His daughters grew up knowing the difference between a father who was present on paper and one who was present in practice. And the way they speak about their parents now, the warmth reserved entirely for their mother, the silence maintained around their father, tells you everything about which kind of father Andrew was. But it did not stop with the negligence. Because what came next made all of that look minor by comparison. While Andrew was building distance within his own family, he was also forming connections elsewhere, relationships that would later have serious consequences. At the same time he was shaping his public identity after leaving the Navy, he developed a close association with a man many people already viewed with suspicion, Jeffrey Epstein. That relationship would eventually unravel in a way that not only damaged Andrew's reputation, but also pulled his daughters into a situation they had no control over. Andrew first met Epstein in 1999. At the time, Epstein was known for his wealth and powerful connections, moving within elite social circles across the United States and Europe. Even then, there were concerns about his behavior. Though the full extent of his crimes was not yet widely known, Andrew, like others in similar circles, was drawn to the access and influence Epstein seemed to offer. Over time, their association grew stronger and more visible. The turning point came in 2008 when Epstein pleaded guilty in Florida to charges involving a minor. He served a short prison sentence, and by that point many people distanced themselves from him. Andrew did not. Instead, Prince Andrew maintained contact, and in 2010 visited Epstein at his New York residence. This decision drew significant criticism later, as it happened after Epstein's conviction had already become public knowledge. What makes this situation more troubling is how Andrew's personal relationships began to overlap with his family life. Reports that surfaced years later suggested that his daughters, Princess Beatrice and Princess Eugenie, were indirectly drawn into the orbit of his social world. For example, it was reported that family photographs of the young princesses were included in correspondence sent to Epstein, even after his conviction. While there is no indication that the daughters were aware of this, it highlighted how Andrew's choices blurred the boundaries between his private associations and his role as a father. There were also social overlaps that raised questions. Individuals connected to Epstein's network were reportedly present at events linked to Andrew and his family. One such example involved gatherings around important family milestones, where controversial figures were included in the wider social circle. For Beatrice, moments that should have been purely personal, such as celebrations marking adulthood, became indirectly tied to her father's associations. Another example often cited is Andrew's connection to individuals outside Epstein's circle, whose backgrounds were also questionable. Gifts and invitations involving such figures added to the sense that his judgment about who to bring into his family's world was at times deeply flawed. These were not decisions his daughters could influence, yet they were the ones whose lives were affected by the public exposure that followed. By the time more detailed information about Epstein became widely available years later, the impact on Andrew's family was unavoidable. When documents related to Epstein were released publicly, Reports suggested that both Beatrice and Eugenie were shocked by what they learned. They had largely remained silent in public, but sources close to them described reactions of disbelief and distress. The situation was no longer just about their father's reputation. It had become part of their own story in the eyes of the public. The situation got worse in November 2019, when Andrew agreed to a televised interview with Emily Maitlis on BBC Newsnight. The interview was intended to address growing questions about his connection to Epstein. Instead, it became a defining moment that intensified public scrutiny. During the interview, Andrew denied any wrongdoing and rejected allegations made by Virginia Giuffre, who claimed she had been trafficked to him as a minor. He stated that he did not recall meeting her and offered explanations that were widely questioned by both the public and experts. Among these was a claim about a medical condition affecting his ability to sweat, which drew skepticism from medical professionals. However, the most widely discussed aspect of the interview was the alibi he provided. Andrew said he could not have been present at a particular time because he was elsewhere with his daughter Beatrice at a restaurant in Woking. He presented this as a clear and specific memory, suggesting it confirmed his innocence. The response was immediate and severe. Public reaction to the interview was overwhelmingly negative. Media coverage intensified. Sponsors and organizations quickly distanced themselves, and within days Andrew stepped back from public royal duties. Over time he lost his official roles, military titles and patronages. What was intended to repair his image instead accelerated its collapse. For his daughters, the situation created a different kind of pressure. Beatrice's name had been used publicly as part of her father's defense, placing her directly into a global controversy without any indication she had chosen to be involved. Events from her past, including milestone celebrations, were revisited and reinterpreted through the lens of the Epstein scandal. This kind of exposure can be deeply unsettling, especially when it connects personal memories to public controversy. Reports at the time suggested that both sisters were under significant emotional strain. They were navigating the fallout while trying to maintain a composed public image as expected of members of the royal family. At the same time, they had to process the personal impact of the situation privately, supported largely by their immediate families and partners. What makes this period particularly significant is how it combines two patterns that had already been present in Andrew's life: distance within his family and questionable judgment in his external relationships. These patterns converged in a way that directly affected his daughters, not through their own actions, but through circumstances beyond their control. Beatrice and Eugenie did not choose the people their father associated with, nor did they shape the decisions that led to public scandal. Yet they became part of the story, both in media coverage and in public perception. Their lives, which had already been shaped by an unusual upbringing, were further complicated by events that placed their family under intense scrutiny. The long-term effects of this are difficult to measure from the outside. What can be observed, however, is how both women have continued to maintain a relatively low public profile compared to other members of the royal family, focusing on their own careers and families. When they do speak publicly, they tend to emphasize stability, resilience, and the importance of close personal relationships, values that reflect the environment in which they were raised. And that is why Sarah Ferguson is speaking up now. For years, Sarah Ferguson had a formula, and she stuck to it with remarkable consistency. No matter what the headline said, no matter what new information surfaced, she would sit in front of a camera and deliver the same essential message. Andrew was a good man, a devoted father, a misunderstood figure who deserved the benefit of the doubt. She said it on Good Morning Britain. She said it in magazine profiles. She said it in charity appearances and daytime television sofas across Britain and America. The formula never changed because for a long time she believed it was the right thing to do. But formulas have a breaking point. As the Epstein files deepened and the titles disappeared and the arrest became a reality, something in how Ferguson chose to speak began to shift. Not dramatically, not in a single explosive interview that the world could point to as the moment she turned, but quietly, gradually, and in the accumulation of small details that only become clear when you step back and look at all of them together. She stopped including him in the picture, especially after he used Beatrice as a defense. That might sound like a small thing. It was not. When Ferguson spoke about the hardest years of her life, the cancer diagnoses, the surgeries, the recovery, she described who was there. She described who held her up. And the answer every single time was her daughters, not Andrew, not the man she had continued to defend publicly for 3 decades, her girls. She gave that picture a name. She called the 3 of them a tripod, herself, Beatrice and Eugenie. 3 women, she said, propping each other up through thick and thin. It was a warm image. It was also a precise one. A tripod has 3 legs, not 4. and the person missing from that count was not mentioned by accident. In 2024, speaking to Platinum magazine about her daughter's support through her cancer battle, she said her girls had been rock solid. She described them as her anchor through the most frightening period of her recent life. She spoke about their loyalty and their consistency and the way they showed up without being asked. Andrew was not in that conversation. The clearest moment came not from Ferguson herself but from Beatrice. When she appeared on This Morning in May 2024 to discuss her mother's recovery, she spoke about Ferguson with the kind of warmth that is only possible when someone has genuinely earned it. She called her a phenomenal icon. She described her resilience as something that keeps her going personally. She said her mother at 64 was finally coming into her own. It was a long interview. Andrew's name did not come up once. That silence, from a daughter speaking publicly about her family on national television, told the story more clearly than any direct statement could have. Ferguson had spent 30 years managing what was said about Andrew. Now her own daughter was on live television talking about their family, and he was not part of the picture she chose to paint. What Ferguson eventually did say in the spaces between the carefully managed public appearances was darker. Sources close to the family described her as inconsolable following the arrest. She was scared, not just for Andrew but for herself. The Epstein documents had referenced her own communications. Her charity had closed, her title was gone. Her home at Royal Lodge had been reclaimed. She had built an entire second act around the image of a reformed, resilient woman who had survived the worst the tabloids could throw at her. And now that image was crumbling alongside his. She went into hiding. First the Austrian Alps, then France, then the United Arab Emirates. And the trio she had described so warmly in interviews, the three women who held each other up, was left standing without her. Beatrice and Eugenie kept going. They attended royal engagements. They protected their children. They said nothing publicly about their father or their mother. Three women who had spent their entire lives managing the consequences of other people's choices, still doing exactly that. By the start of 2026, the distance between Andrew and his daughters was no longer something inferred or quietly observed. It was being reported openly. In January, multiple outlets carried claims that Princess Eugenie had cut off contact with her father entirely. According to those reports, she had not visited him during the Christmas period, and was no longer speaking to him. The story was discussed publicly on Good Morning Britain, where Susanna Reid addressed it directly on air. Commentators suggested that Eugenie's absence from her father's side, particularly during a traditionally family-centered time like Christmas, was not by mistake or symbolic. It reflected a deeper shift. Royal analyst Afua Hagan noted that while private support can never be fully ruled out, public actions often tell their own story. In this case, Eugenie's decision to remain separate from her father in visible settings pointed to a clear boundary being drawn. That boundary appeared to be rooted not just in personal emotion, but in values. The suggestion was that at a certain point, maintaining distance becomes less about loyalty and more about what an individual is willing to be associated with, especially when public life and reputation are involved. For someone like Eugenie, who had spent her entire life under scrutiny, that distinction carried real weight. Princess Beatrice, by contrast, seemed to take a more measured approach. She had not fully severed ties and continued to maintain some level of contact. In December 2025, Beatrice invited her father to the christening of her daughter, a private family event, but even that moment was carefully contained. There were no public photographs of them together, no shared appearances, and no statements that might be interpreted as a broader show of support. The invitation itself stood as a minimal gesture, acknowledging a personal connection without extending it into the public sphere. Then in February 2026, the situation escalated sharply. Andrew was arrested at his residence on his 66th birthday, an event that immediately drew widespread attention. The circumstances of the arrest, linked to ongoing scrutiny around his past associations, brought the issue back into headlines with renewed intensity. In the immediate aftermath, both Beatrice and Eugenie remained silent. There were no public statements, no visible responses, and no attempts to defend or explain. Instead, they withdrew from view. Reports suggested that their upcoming plans had been adjusted with appearances reconsidered and schedules altered. The focus, it seemed, had shifted toward managing the impact rather than engaging with the controversy directly. Sources close to the situation described their reaction in strong terms, not as defensive or dismissive, but as deeply unsettled. There was a sense of concern, not only about what had already happened, but about what might still emerge. That kind of response suggests a break between expectation and reality, where events unfold in ways that force a reassessment of what was previously understood. The consequences did not remain confined to private life. They followed both women into their public roles, affecting how they were seen and where they were able to appear. One of the clearest examples came with reports that they had been excluded from Royal Ascot in 2026. The decision, according to coverage at the time, was tied to the broader fallout from their families' associations. For Beatrice and Eugenie, this represented a loss of access to an event that had long been part of royal tradition. It was not a decision they had made, but one that was made about them. Despite having their own careers, charitable work, and independent identities, they were still being judged in relation to their father's actions. Commentators framed this as part of a larger issue: the weight of a family name. The York name, which at once carried status and recognition, had become increasingly complicated. For the daughters, it was not something they could set aside. It was tied to their identity, their history, and their public roles. What makes this situation particularly difficult is the lack of control. Beatrice and Eugenie did not shape the decisions that led to the controversy, yet they continue to experience its effects. Their choices now revolve around how to respond, how to balance personal relationships with public responsibility, and how to move forward in a context they did not create. For Beatrice and Eugenie, the challenge now is not just about distancing themselves from controversy, but about defining who they are within it and deciding what parts of that legacy they are willing to carry forward. And that is all because of what their father did to them. Looking at it all together, does it change how you see him, and which moment hit differently for you? Drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more deep dives that you will love.